Okay, stream is being switched over. Here is the agenda in the chat. Sharing it with the people on the internet if they want to follow along. People of the internet, let me know when you can hear us. Cool. Welcome everybody. I think we had 3 weeks since the last one. A lot's going down. We just released V07 the other day. This is generally not a crazy, like, major, semi-major release, but because it has breaking changes, but it's not a major release. It's just kind of iterative, so that if it helps you follow along between now and the end of June, to have something that you can like bite into, by all means. But if you'd rather wait till the end of June, do your thing. The end of June release is going to be, and the subsequent minor fixes from there is going to be probably what most people are targeting. So this middle one is just for your use if you want it. Cool. So we will get started with testing. The V07 vectors are out. Our tests have become even more inefficient in the Python one, mainly due to the tree hashing. So we're kind of exploring some of the caching methods to speed that up. But right now it's not a major blocker. It mainly just makes generating the tests for y'all take longer, but that's an isolated one-time thing. Proto, what else has been going on in testing? You there, Proto? Okay, there is an ongoing...
Yes.
Oh,
sorry.
Great.
I'm here.
Cool.
I was planning to reconnect since the Wi-Fi is flaky. So about testing.
We lost you.
You broke up.
Yeah. Cool. I messaged him on the side channel. Maybe he can reconnect. I will let Proto update us, but there's been much effort going on in the fuzzing, primarily the fuzzing of his Go specification, and getting some machinery in place to fuzz the Python spec implementation as well, and do differential fuzzing and things like that. But Proto will update us if he can.
Moment, I will reconnect. I just already did update, but
oh no,
connection went down.
Okay, cool. Well, Proto, if you will give him 1 minute to reconnect, see how that goes. And everyone else get ready for client updates. Welcome back, Proto.
Hey, great.
That sounds
So,
much better.
okay,
covered something about the fuzzing?
I just said it's ongoing, but if you want to dig in, please do.
Okay, so there's these two efforts. We have fuzzing and we have coverage testing, both trying to find new bugs and everything that's being missing in the current spec tests. And so with fuzzing, we primarily just discover more input bugs where like new kind of inputs have to be checked. So you add more conditions to the spec there. And then there's these rare occasions where there's actually something really funny happening. But we try to tackle that more fundamentally with just the unit testing and coverage checking. And it brings me to the second point where coverage checking really helps identify the few parts of the spec that are untested. And I want to like complement that with new tests. And then we get a fully tested spec.
Yep. Cool. And this fuzzing effort right now is pretty isolated to the two just implementations of the spec, the Go and Python. But we hope to expand it to clients eventually. But right now, as it gets the spec freeze, we just want to find these spec bugs. Cool. Any other testing updates, testing related things?
One thing which might be worth highlighting on the fuzzing is that Guido tried replacing SHA-256 with XX hash. So XX hash is a non-cryptographic hash function. So we can't use it in production, but it's much faster than SHA-256. And what he found with Zerenity is that it runs the fuzzing about 3 times faster. So it might be worth having some sort of a flag in the client implementations to switch over to XX hash so that we can just do 3 times more fuzzing on the same amount of resources.
Agreed. Cool. Thank you. Let's move on to client updates. How about Prismatic?
Yeah, hey guys. So last time we've talked, I mentioned that we aligned block processing and epoch processing to 0.6. So yesterday we just aligned that with 0.7 as well. We also re-implement caching, the way we cache stuff with 0.7. Because since last time we had caching, everything was 0.2. So we had to redid a lot of caching layers since the shuffling and the way we get committees are different now. I also did some benchmark for the state transition with profiler and tracer, and then I've done optimize a little bit on the block and epoch processing side of things. And at the end, we're just working on test vector alignment and make sure our SSD is up to date. Yep, and that's it.
Great, thank you. How about Parity?
So for us, so we also just got the 0.7 spec implemented yesterday, and we passed all the test vectors. So for us is that we decided to deliberately not implement any caching right now before the spec is frozen. Just we don't want to redo any of the works. And for next, I think for Jasper, the focus right now would be to get a more proper network implementation. Right now, what we have is a really simple float sub, which works. But what we want to do probably in the really short term is to reintroduce the substrate network library and use that to get a proper networking communication layer for our client so we can launch some new testnets. So that's for us.
Great, thanks. Congrats on the test vectors. How about Artemis?
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So we did a lot of profiling and optimizing on our state transition stuff. So we, like, I guess when we first merged in 5.1, we noticed that none of our optimizations and caching worked anymore. So reprofiled it, re-implementing the caching. We're starting on the next version of the spec. The good news is also that like our short-lived testnets can run pretty much indefinitely on our white block network. We have also broken out our validator client implementation to kind of fall in line with the lead of the other clients. You know, how they've made them discrete from the beacon chain, so that's good. And oh yeah, also Joe wrote a pretty cool article about posit Merkle tree implementation. Y'all should check out. I think it's floating around somewhere on Twitter, so a bunch of y'all might have already seen it. And I think that's it, pretty much.
Awesome. Exciting to hear about indefinite finale. Cool. Yeah, the article, Joe, just as Joe is figuring out how to handle the proofs coming in from the deposit contract and then handling them on the beacon chain, he just highlighted his thoughts so that other people can get to there faster.
Oh, the other thing, we're also working with Harmony and Raul from Protocol Labs on a minimal JVM implementation of libp2p, and then the other thing is that we released a bunch of bounties. Joe Lubin funded a bunch of bounties because everyone's like wicked busy. We, you know, for a minimal kind of super simple network implementation so that we can test the kind of the consensus layer in a kind of multi-client kind of test net. And, you know, and that hopefully will free teams up in a way to continue the work on the real network stack and the testing that needs to be done there. And I've spoken to a bunch of y'all on different channels and stuff, but I still need to talk to, I think Jason's really the last one. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Cool. Thanks, Johnny, and thanks, Joe Lubin. Great. How about Trinity?
Hello. So yeah, there are a bunch of us in Osaka right now. And for the Trinity update, so recently, Alex has started at working on the state transition update to version 0.7. And we are using Chia Network's BOS library on our testnet implementation before the BOS and is finalized. And also, Kevin is working on the Eth2.0 deposit contract monitor. And we're going to use it to track the deposit contract logs on the Eth2.0 chain. I think that's it. Oh, also, we keep working on the Discovery version 5 implementation by Yannick. Yeah, thank you.
Nice, thanks. Are y'all planning on using Trinity as the Eth2.1 monitor?
Sorry?
Are you planning on using the Eth2.1 implementation in Trinity as the monitoring for, or are you just writing it in Web3 to connect to whatever node?
Currently, I'm using Web3.py.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Cool. Thank you. How about Lodestar?
Hey, y'all. So in a branch, we are passing the V06 spec tests, except for BLS verification. So we're still working through that. It's kind of odd because we're passing the BLS spec tests, like the ones for BLS specifically.
Oh, interesting.
we think it has to do with like which private keys are being used. I'm not really working on it particular. Marin.
Right. There
really
was a
one of our
question
guys.
about potentially the use of one as a private key.
Yeah, that's our best guess right now.
Okay. Interesting.
We've also in the past few weeks we integrated Gossip Sub and implemented the RPC protocol as it exists in the spec right now. So we now have like a networking layer, and we're also toying around with pulling out pieces of our code and rewriting them in assembly script, which is a language that looks like TypeScript, but it compiles to WASM. And we're starting with our LMD Ghost just to try something out and get used to the tooling. And our next steps, we're working towards like kind of end-to-end short-lived testnets. And we have a little bit of refactoring to do to make our like constants more swappable for testnet configuration. And we also need to finish our syncing module so we can sync between the network and the chain.
Cool. Sounds good. Was that it, Cayman?
Yeah, that's it.
Cool. Great. And Nimbus.
Yeah. So regarding the spec, we have 2 PRs pending for 0.7 compatibility, and we still have to do more. For now, we sync the low-hanging fruits. We have the backward sync integrated, so that means requesting all blocks up to a point is available. On the networking side, we have lip2p integration in Nimbus, and we are currently working on releasing lip2p based testnet instead of RPX that we were using so far. So this is using the daemon. And on the lip2p library in pure NIM, so right now we have an issue on mobile because when the mobile phone makes the application sleep, it kills the connection. So that's one of the pending issue. On the if1 front, we now have an API to watch the validator contract. The goal is to use Nimbus for that. And regarding if1 security, we have starting to do fuzzing on discovery and fixing bugs on discovery and RLP for if1 implementation. And we have an open question with all clients. We would like to have some data visualization of testnets, and maybe we should add to the interop agenda in September some kind of minimal RPC standards to request to clients, like the block they are on, how many things they're processed, so that we can have some kind of nice display of what's going on in a multi-client testnet.
Yeah, agreed. Antoine, does any of your work relevant to that, the work that you've been doing on standardizing some of the metrics?
What do you guys want to know? I've pushed this thing to Ethereum repo so everybody can go and take a look at the metrics. I think they're mostly implemented by nobody at this point. There's some good ideas from Prism that I recycle into this, some feedback from the different implementers. So feel free to take a look and get inspired. But there's no conformance to this that is required at this point. So just, I don't know if you know about that repo. It's under Ethereum Eth2.0-metrics, if I remember.
Hey guys, Preston put together a really nice document on the data API. I just posted the link. So if you guys can take a look, I think a lot of the information will be there. as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey-
Also, that was Prism was one of the. We knew that you had something for data retrieval, so if we can make it so that you don't have to re-implement everything, that would be nice as well.
Yeah, I have a question about this. Why make it an RPC when just every slot? Why don't we just dump it to a log file that's nicely formatted?
You have two kind of ways for the metrics. Either you do a push, so that's what you said. We push that to a database or to a log file, and then the consumer will retrieve that. Or the other way is pull. So it requests what's your state, and you just reply.
And you're saying both are useful, basically.
I don't know. It really depends on.
The problem with pull is that you have to be like in sync. You have to know like, hey, every slot I better ask if I want like continuous data.
Talking to some of the big data like API consumers, like Amber Data, they want both. So having the ability to just kind of have everything dumped and then to go in and ask for granular information is also valuable. So
okay, let's add that to the spec then. The ability to just dump it. What do you think, or the proposal?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So just to chime in real quick here about the document that Terrence linked. This week I'm putting together a more like formal like the API design. So this would have like batch request, requesting things by slot. Like it's still a pull method, but this supports data providers like Amber Data or Etherscan or anybody who wants to build some sort of read, access, consume data remotely, without having access to the file system. So it supports that use case. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do file-based logging, but that's what this document's for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so they can go back in history and be like, I want slot, 6 through 64 or something. All the information. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two different things here too. What Mami was talking about is metrics, like the kind of developer useful metrics for tracking how your system is performing. I think that's what Anton has been working on too with his Prometheus stuff. And then I think what Preston is talking about is more of like it's more of like an API for the users of the application. We've been thinking of them as completely different things. So our metrics and logging, like Mami was talking about, the push or pull, I think. We've been like, it's kind of rough. We just leave it for the developers. We add as we want. And then we've been taking, like, we appreciate like Preston's approach with the actual proper API where we think about it and we don't add things that are useless and stuff like this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
Hi. Sorry, guys. Jacek here.
What's up?
Wanted to add a little note here that like every one of these services that we add to clients, they represent, first of all, the security sort of surface area, and also performance surface area that we should be evaluating together with, like, against the utility that they bring. So it's easy to like think that we should have like, push and pull and metrics and logs and a whole bunch of historical services and everybody should support everything. But realistically looking at it, like the core functionality of the client remains to vote on blocks. The rest is kind of nice to have fluff.
Yeah, we're gonna hide our metrics behind a compile flag.
The developer stuff?
Yeah, that's right. But we will have to have an API, otherwise it'll just be a black box.
Also, Mikira here, we can also have these like extra stuff as optional for client developers, or make it easy for other people to come and build out other tooling using these APIs. They don't necessarily have to be included in all of our clients.
I very much agree. I mean, a lot of the stuff on the Perfora, even if it makes it into the specs repo, like the validator, the general like validator request API, like that's not actually part of consensus. So like, a client does not have to conform. So yeah.
So I'll second what Mikera says there. Like, we should really be focusing on building blocks that others can use, maybe for building services, rather than trying to build all the services ourselves.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you still have to expose data in some capacity. Yes, Joseph, clients should conform to some standard. Mami, were you done? We kind of sidetracked on that.
Yeah, that was the last thing.
Okay. Cool. Harmony.
Yep. So we have completed wire implementation and the regular sync, and has released beacon node version with a custom simple transport, aka plain TCP and fluid sub. So, so we finally got several nodes in a single network, which may enter, exit, and sync with each other. So we are now up to date with 0.6.3 spec version and passing all the compatibility tests. So currently we are working, started work on adoption of the latest spec version. We started working on validator PC interface. And also, as Johnny mentioned, we started to work on minimal libp2p JVM implementation. Yep, so that's it.
Great, thanks, Anton. Lighthouse.
Hey, so we're up to date with spec 0.6.3. We're passing all the tests that we haven't raised issues about. We've added, as we were talking about before, some Prometheus stuff. So we're running our test nets and looking at graphs about what's doing. It's ridiculously easy with the Prometheus and Grafana to get like a dashboard going. So well done to Prism for highlighting that one. We've got lots of progress on Dis v5. I think Adrian's testing it now. Not sure if he's feature complete. We've been fuzzing with our own fuzzing tools, and we found bugs in upstreams, which is really good. Kirk has been working on Vitalik's optimized BLS signature scheme. He's going well with that, I believe. We got the REST API for the validators merged into master. And we're stress testing testnets with 1 second block times and trying to see if we can break it. So we're finding bugs and we're fixing them, so it's good.
How much forking are you seeing in testnet with 1 second block times?
Not a whole lot because we're not adding network latency into it yet.
Gotcha.
So we're seeing a little bit, but we're mostly just trying to test like if we can sync under really heavy loads, and it's
Gotcha.
working well. But we're going to add, there's this really cool tool called Pumba, P-U-M-B-A, which adds like latencies, and it's basically a chaos monkey for Docker setups. So we're going to start applying that to our setups, and then see what falls over and see what stands up.
And so I have a question. So your fuzzing tool, is that specifically for Lighthouse, or are you going to generalize it so that other clients, teams can use it as well?
The one that we're using now is specific to Lighthouse, and it's like kind of part of our package manager system, Cargo. We would consider making it. Let me rephrase that. The reason we haven't made it generic is because there's already efforts on a generic fuzzer, so we figured that one will be useful. And this one we're trying to keep it so it's, I don't know, it doesn't. It's a bit easier to wrangle because it doesn't have to be generic. But once the one exists that everyone can use, we'll definitely be helping out with that one too. I think Medi's already a part of that effort.
Yeah, this is a Rust specific one, and we're just targeting very specific functions inside our networking stack and Lighthouse specifically. But I don't imagine you can't target other functions in other clients.
Cool. Thanks, guys. And Proto, do you know of any update on Geth?
No, Gav has been relatively quiet on updating to or figuring out what to do with the specs. But about fuzzing, the things with the current generalized fuzzing effort is that it's primarily like spec focused or consensus focused. It's fuzzing the state machine. It doesn't fuzz, say, your performance bottlenecks like storage or networking. So what Lighthouse is doing, build it out in for your specific implementation for that part of your stack. Then we can share the consensus fuzzing.
Right. And I know Dean from Yeeth is planning on picking back up some work after the spec freeze. Hey, Dean. Cool. Let's move on. Next thing is research updates. I know there's a lot going on the phase 2 front.
So the main update I have from my side is probably the SSZ partial stuff that I did over the last couple of weeks. So basically, I was finally managed to get the SSZ partials implemented in Python, and the main realization I got out of that is that it's just way more complex at present than it needs to be. And the bulk of the complexity comes from the fact that Merkle proof lengths in dynamically sized objects like lists are kind of dynamically sized instead of being fixed length. And if you remove that property, so if you come up with some way so that there is an exact kind of stable one-to-one correspondence between paths and generalized indices. So if some particular object or some particular element of an SSZ object would always have the exact same sequence of moving left and right down the Merkle tree to get to it, then that would actually remove probably the bulk of the complexity from the SSZ partial implementation. So from realizing that, there are some discussions that I had with Dinkrat and some other people, and the proposal that we seem to be converging on is basically requiring lists.
We lost you, Vitalik. But it's requiring lists to have a max length so that you can always have them in the same position in the tree.
He sounded out of breath. I'm concerned.
All right, I was just walking upstairs. I'm up the stairs now.
Oh, cool. Well, we can hear you again. You said requiring lists to have
a maximum length. So basically, like basically think of it as being identical to how types in Viper work, where in Viper, like you could have a fixed length list that has n values, or you could have a dynamic length list. But if you have a dynamic length list, you have to specify what the maximum length is. And then the idea would be that the SSZ serialization would not change at all, except maybe at some point later in the future, we might want to add another SSZ serialization type for sparse lists, but that's like not something we have to discuss today. But for SSZ hashing, the length of a Merkle branch would be a fixed value. So if, for example, your list had a maximum length of 20, then 20 gets rounded up to 32 because that's the next power of 2. So the length of a Merkle branch would always be 5. So there would just always be a 32 item tree, regardless of what the quote actual length of the list is. And so that way, the kind of Merkle path needed to get to the, say, third item in the list would just always be like left, right, left. And it doesn't change depending on what the kind of current dynamic size of the list is.
Yep. Cool. I just linked to the issue where this discussion's happening. It's generally not a major change to the serialization, but it's as you said, a simplification on the tree hashing side and the being able to make proofs about things in the tree hash.
Yeah, like the only thing this requires is that we'd have to run through the block and state data structures and for every dynamic list stick a maximum on it. For the block data structure in phase 0, there's no problem because we already have a natural maximum, which is the constant for the maximum number of each object type in a block. The one thing in the state that's currently dynamic is the validator set. And for the validator set, like we just need to have something with a reasonably high maximum, like something like 2 to the 40, and then we'll be okay for a really long time.
There's another, the historic roots is unbounded currently.
Right.
But
historic roots we can also set to 2 to the 40 if we want, but
yeah. Cool. Is there any other? I know we have maybe some phase 2 researchers here. Is any an update on that?
And so the thing I've been thinking about myself is just how abstracted fee markets would work and how like basically how block producers could collect fees in the context of these different execution environments existing. So the main design goal here, right, is just to simplify the experience for block proposers and make it so that block proposers can get a fair amount of revenue without having to personally understand 55 different subprotocols. And so I came up with this idea where there would be a standard for how execution environments pay fees, and they would issue receipts in a standardized format, and then basically the execution environment will collect fees from transaction senders. The execution environment would issue a receipt. The execution environment would have an account at a standard execution environment that we call the fee market, and block producers would be able to publish receipts and collect fees from there. Will had a counter proposal where instead of using receipts, you would use synchronous calls, and this would involve this proposal of transaction base layer transactions being able to call other base layer transactions inside of themselves. So that's interesting too. Another thing I realized we need to start taking seriously as a kind of subplot of L2 moving forward is light clients and light client server markets. Like basically because everyone will be a light client in almost every shard, like there's going to be heavy reliance on these nodes that have state associated with particular shards and that could provide Merkle branches in exchange for payments through a payment channel. And if you have that architecture, then the light client servers could also just be the relayers in these transaction packaging relayer markets. But like the category of node that specializes in maintaining state for a particular shard is something that kind of needs to exist. And it's something we probably want to start thinking about more. And I know like some of the guest developers like Jolt spent some time thinking about this in the context of ETH1, so it might make sense to interact more with them too.
Yeah, he's currently, I don't know if it's public, but he's working on a proposal for using channels. I think he's actually looking to use some rating to fund the light servers on ETH1.
Yay.
Mm-hmm. Any other research updates?
I can just give a quick update from Pegasus Research. The only thing is that the handle paper, which is aggregation of BLS signatures at large scale, is now published on Archive, and I put the link in the chat. It's a good read. Take a look.
Great, congratulations.
So going back to phase 2, one of the things that I've tried to look at is basically what is the work that has to be done to make an ETH1 execution engine. And I guess there's quite a there's quite a bit of work to be done, but the good news is that a lot of it can be done incrementally. Some of it is stuff that we want to do anyway, even if we don't go with a ETH1 execution engine. And there's also nice intermediate stages that we can reach. For example, kind of a two-way peg between ETH1 and ETH2, which is a nice stepping stone for a fully native ETH1 execution engine. I guess one thing which might be worth sharing as well is that there seems to be rough consensus that we wouldn't want to launch phase 2 without any execution engine, just the basic logic, the very thin layer. Instead, we would want to go with a kind of more controlled launch where we have either ETH1 as an execution engine, or kind of a new execution engine which has all the goodies that we've been looking into and researching for the last few years. I'll call that the ETH2 execution engine, or both at the same time.
Yeah, 100% agreed on that. Like, releasing it without anything, I think, would be silly from the community perspective. I'm even interested in potentially launching with a restricted, there's only 1 or 2 execution engines at the beginning, so that they can be, we can work out the kinks rather than having a field day.
Right, absolutely. And in addition to the consensus layer code, I think there will be significant kind of external infrastructure that needs to be built out and tested, like the fee market that Vitalik was talking about.
Yeah, light client servers are the big one I'm worried about.
Right. I mean, we might also want to test like statelessness more thoroughly or things like that. I guess the other update that I wanted to talk about is about ETH2 Genesis for phase 0. So basically, one of the things that's been merged in recently is the removal of the ETH2 Genesis log from the deposit contract, and we've replaced it in favor of a custom function, which is kind of subjectively run client-side, as it were, which is both more secure because it allows us to better capture what we want to have as a trigger for the ETH2 Genesis, and also more flexible. So there's basically a few requirements for Genesis. We want to make sure that there's sufficient ETH at stake. Right now we're thinking 2 million ETH, but we also want to make sure that there's sufficient production level clients. Ideally 3, but if there's only 2, we could even launch with 2. So if we were to bake in a trigger in the deposit contract, and for some reason we're not ready to launch, then this gives us the flexibility to update the Genesis trigger. I guess from a timing perspective, I'd say we're still on track for the phase 0 spec freeze on June 30th. So that might be a good opportunity at the end of this month to think about new realistic targets. And I guess 2 good milestones to think about is 1, when do we want to launch the deposit contract? So the idea here is to try and launch the deposit contract ahead of the target Genesis, so that we allow time for validators to make deposits. And one idea here is to basically do a deposit contract ceremony at DEF CON. And one of the reasons of having this very public ceremony is so that we can all agree on the exact address of the deposit contract and avoid scam deposit contracts. I guess we still have quite a bit of time before the end of 2019. So I think looking at a target Genesis date towards the end of 2019 could be realistic. One thing that could work well is the 3rd of January 2020. So that kind of comes after the December holidays, which are generally quieter, and it would be the 11th anniversary of the Bitcoin Genesis, and that would give us, if assuming that we do the deposit contract ceremony at DEF CON, that would allow for 3 months for deposits to accumulate to reach 2 million ETH, and it would allow for 7 months from today for at least 2 clients to reach production status.
You mentioned production status. Have you thought of criteria for what that means?
Well, I guess at the very least that we have a long-running, cross-client testnet, which has gone through security audits, that's gone through fuzzing, parts of which have gone through formal verification, and potentially, hasn't suffered major issues for a healthy amount of time. I don't know.
I'm inclined to agree with that. Like same as what we had in ETH1, long-running testnet, some period of time with no bugs, and security auditing on all the clients.
All right, I think that would be good to write down in some post somewhere, so that we have some clear criteria. And at least it would be useful for us client developers as well.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I think that it launching the deposit contract, we should at least have some target for going to production, because otherwise, we're asking people to put their money into a contract, at least if they do it early for some indefinite amount of time, which if we do ask them to put their money in for an indefinite amount of time, people might not actually show up and might not have a good read on the participation levels that we expect.
I have another meeting I need to get into, so I will say goodbye here.
Bye, Vitalik.
Yep.
But I do like the idea of the kind of ceremony or the public nature of making that deposit contract, because I'm slightly concerned about scam addresses too.
I had a quick question about the deposit contract. So I'm assuming that the changes that you're talking about now are replacing the log with a function for Eth2 Genesis. Is that am I grasping that correctly?
Yes. So essentially, instead of listening for that log, you're running a function locally when you get a new deposit on whether it's time to start.
Oh, okay. It's a it's a call rather than a send. It's gonna be like some sort of it's gonna be just not gonna execute. It's not gonna require gas for execution. It's gonna have a
No, not even in the deposit contract. So I'm receiving logs locally, and I have local logic on whether to start the Genesis.
Oh, okay.
So I can say,
building. I got it.
Yeah, simply I could be like, have there been 100 deposits? Great, I'm going to start. But we can make the logic more sophisticated. We can make it, have there been 100 deposits? Have there been 90 full deposits? And is it this date yet? And so we can more manage it locally, and we can be a little bit more dynamic with it if we need to postpone things or whatever. So we're not beholden to whatever ends up being in that contract. I think it's just mildly simpler and more flexible.
Yeah, we do lose one aspect, though. We lose the aspect of kind of having a shared source of truth for this Eth2 Genesis route for the deposits. We lose that, but
right. So, but it would be, that would need to be part of the local calculation as well, right? Like, whatever deposit triggered it would also need to be the state of the contract at that time, in terms of the route.
Yeah. So do you not want to make it an actual function on the smart contract so you have the flexibility to change it? Is that why?
Yes.
And we can have more sophisticated logic. Right now, like the calculation of full deposit doesn't take into account if people send in partial deposits. So like if I send in 16 and then 16, it doesn't count as a full deposit, but you could count that locally. So you could do a little bit more sophisticated things as well. But Justin, you had a comment?
Yeah, I mean, that was the initial trigger where we realized that people could make just one ETH deposit, the minimum, and make a bunch of these and then trigger the genesis. And sorry, let me that's one attack. The attack was that someone makes 32 ETH deposits or full deposits to the same address repeatedly, and then they trigger the genesis basically with a huge asymmetry in the distribution of the ETH, and then potentially they could withdraw this one address and use that to their advantage somehow. But the other thing is that the shared source of truth argument is a little bit of an illusion, and the reason is that we need an alternative, a backup mechanism without a preset kind of source of truth if we don't reach the target. So if the deposit contract says yes, go ahead, and we're not ready, then we need a backup mechanism anyway.
Right on. Yeah, that makes sense. But I do wonder why then we would calculate the sparse Merkle tree in the contract, because essentially that sparse Merkle tree is useless if we're not ever emitting an ETH2 genesis root value, right?
No,
go on.
Sorry, it's still valuable. So the sparse Merkle tree for the deposit basically allows for the accounting of the deposits and making sure that it's properly reflected on Eth2.
Right, so when you're voting, you can still call that mechanism. You also, but most people will be handling a tree locally. So it's a helper. It ends up being a helper accessor. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. Like in case, say, you started running this a year from now as a validator, you might use that mechanism and actually have just a more sparse view of the deposits locally instead of having the entire tree. So it does provide some optionality, but you're right, it's not 100% necessary anymore.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could expose get deposit root as a public method, and that would kind of like allow people to.
Mm-hmm. Is it private? I'm honestly surprised by that.
I'm not sure actually. It may be.
I believe you, but I just it should be public. I think that would be much better.
Yeah, I just checked. It's public.
Okay, cool. Then I guess, yeah, not emitting an event is perfectly fine then, I think.
Cool. Any more research updates before we move on?
I've got a quick update. There were some good conversations about what a token is going to look like on execution environments in Eth2 at scaling Ethereum, and still thinking about different ideas there, but I wanted to share an idea I had and get some feedback on it about removing the need for like 2 transaction flows for ERC20s. So like the basic idea is like extending message.value to support arbitrary tokens. And so I've kind of like written up like a short summary here in an ETH Magician's post that I'm going to share.
Cool. Do you want to tell us more about it now, or maybe we'll give you some feedback after the call?
Yeah, I can tell more about it now. Basically, like the idea like I had is that essentially like sending a transaction to any kind of contract since it's already like signed by you or by your contract wallets, like you're essentially giving permission to like send a token. It's just that right now there's not an ability of saying that you want to also send like some ERC20 or some like token other than Ether in one transaction. It has to be split into like notifying the token contract. And so if we can extend it to where message.value is some token contract address and some amount of tokens, then we can add like some EEI function or opcode essentially that like does a delegate call to the token contract, assuming it supports like some generic interface that supports transfers. And so the message.sender after through that delegate call will still be the message.sender to the target contract that the user wants. And so then it can verify that that user wants to send tokens to that contract.
And help me understand, this is functionality that could be defined in the context of an EE and not protocol-wide?
Yeah, so I mean, like the message.value, that's going to be kind of like an EE concept, since it's not going to be like, it's not going to live at the protocol layer. And so if we can just extend that in that context to be an address and a value, then as long as that the transaction doesn't revert and the contract is able to continue executing after it like kind of consumes that value, then the target contract can assume that it was like, it had the valid transfer and it now like owns the tokens.
Interesting. Any feedback on that, guys? Cool. Okay, take it to Ethereum Magicians. The link was shared. It is cool because it just highlights the kind of extensibility and things that we can play with in execution environments. Okay. Any other research updates before we move on? Great. Moving on to networking. Felix did say sorry he could not join. He has some Discovery v5 updates. The Go implementation is progressing. Still missing integration for the topic stuff, but the basic DHT works. Implementation in Trinity and Lighthouse is ongoing. Rust version is pretty far along. Minor spec changes TBD. And he is currently negotiating an external protocol audit. We have is Mike? Yeah, we have Mike here from LibP2P. Welcome.
Hey, yeah, it's Mike from LibP2P. Raul couldn't make it today; he's traveling, so I don't think he's on. I don't think he's on the call. But yeah, actually, we have a few quick updates. The last call we did like 3 weeks ago, you know, a bunch of people on the call kind of gave us feedback about libp2p, like some you know, production readiness of the implementations, that the daemon wasn't a good enough test environment. So some really useful feedback, and we've tried to take action on a lot of those things that came up. So here's sort of what's going on. As far as the JVM libp2p, I think Johnny covered it. Like there's nothing else I really have to add beyond what he said at the beginning of the call. Well, actually, I'll add one thing. Web3 Labs is also, I don't know if Connor or anyone is on this call or attends, but they're looking to get involved too. So we may get more firepower on that implementation. But even without that, it seems to be progressing pretty well. On the production readiness for JS libp2p, we followed up with the ChainSafe, specifically folks who had worked worked with the JS libp2p and knew kind of what its flaws and warts were. And we're looking at making a grant to kind of fix up some of those things. A lot of them are just documentation issues. So we're working on that. We now have a full-time writer on working on specifications for libp2p. So I know that's been a weak spot, and then everyone who tries to implement it is like, you know, how can I implement this without proper specification? And so we now have a writer who's working on that full time, and he'll continue indefinitely, or until it's complete. What else was I gonna toss out there? Oh, there was some benchmarking at the Scaling Ethereum event in Toronto. We're working with White Block to try to figure out, basically to try to iterate on those tests. It's really good, a good kind of initial work they've done, but we think that some of the test results might be measuring artifacts of the setup more than the gossip subprotocol itself. So we're kind of working with them to figure out how to improve that. And those are all the bullets I had on my list. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Are there any questions for Mike before we move on? And there's a Telegram channel that Mike and Raul are in, where it seems like it's been a good place to at least ask some of the little questions so they can direct you better. So please utilize that. But yeah, any questions for Mike before we move on?
Yeah, I had one. I was thinking about the transports, and there's been this loose plan to sort of move on from SecIO to maybe TLS. Do you have any thoughts on that or any progress updates?
Yeah. It is our intention to move on from SecIO to TLS. The status of TLS varies with implementations. I mean, whether it's complete or not varies with implementation. So like we have a working TLS 1.3 in the Go libp2p implementation. I do not believe we have one in JS. I mean, I could go through all the languages, but the point is not all of them have it. And so we're going to be falling back on SecIO for quite a while. Like when two clients connect, if one of them only supports SecIO, then they'll have to fall back to that. So yeah, that's kind of the state of it. Is this helping address the question, or are you looking for something more specific?
Well, there's two aspects to that question, right? One is like, is it finalized how libp2p over TLS should look like from let's say from a spec perspective or from a functionality perspective? And then obviously, clients, the question there would be, do they have something to implement? And the final question is like, are there any concerns that would prevent TLS from becoming the de facto transport for libp2p once implementations have caught up?
Okay, yeah, I understand. So I'm not a TLS expert, but so I'm going to kind of go in reverse order. On your last question, I am not a TLS expert, but our expert Martin, from talking to him, as far as I know, there's no reason why we would not eventually go 100% TLS once implementations are caught up. We don't know of any theoretical reason not to do that. Then kind of winding back through your earlier questions. Sorry, remind me the second one, the middle one.
So the second and middle one are kind of the same, but like from an implementation perspective, is there, like you're writing
right.
a spec, right? But is it stable? Like, have you decided on what you actually want? Like if
yeah, I think we're happy with the Go implementation. We want to turn that into a spec. That's I can follow up with Martin Seaman, who's our TLS expert, and he implemented that. I can double check on that. But as far as I know, like he thinks we've reached a point where we're satisfied. There's a few issues. The Rust LS, which is like Rust's main TLS library, doesn't support self-signed certificates, which we would like to use in some cases. So there are still some open questions. So I guess true answer to your question is no, we're not fully certain, but I think we're extremely close.
Okay, because it seems to me that like, yeah, especially JavaScript like should have the TLS part of TLS done, sort of. So I wonder how much.
Isn't there somebody working on a TLS implementation for Node.js?
Yeah, I'm curious, like how much of the TLS libp2p stuff is written in, is libp2p's responsibility, and how much is offloaded onto, you know, standardized libraries and environments.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the Node one is not libp2p's responsibility, but libp2p does have like a different sort of specification that's fit for libp2p. So they have a reference Go implementation right now. I don't know if there's a if there's going to be a JavaScript one, or if we're just going to use the Node provided one.
Yeah, I think what Makira is saying is right. So it's not our intention to re-implement TLS in every language. We're mostly relying on language standard libraries. So you know, whether it's Go or the Node one for JS. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Mike, if you can just talk to your guy and get some clarification on some of the details, that'd be useful.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll come back next week and yeah, or 2 weeks.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
This might seem like a stupid question, but what's the technical reason behind implementing TLS or requiring that at all?
Oh, that's a good question. Basically, we want to support something that is an industry standard, and that TLS is the standard. Sec.io is like something that we wrote on our own. We are going to have a security audit of it done, and the people who wrote it are quite knowledgeable about cryptography, but we think that for a lot of use cases, it may be safer to support TLS 1.3. We couldn't use TLS in the past because prior to version 1.3, TLS didn't have, basically it required you to have a notion of a server and a client. Like you had to designate one side as the server and another side as the client. And it doesn't make sense in peer-to-peer. 1.3 finally gives us a way to not make that distinction. So, but anyway, because 1.3 is something that's recent, like this year, we didn't, when we were first developing libp2p, we couldn't use older versions of TLS, and so that's where Sec.io came from.
But if payloads are inherently cryptographically secured from the application layer, what's the point in providing additional encryption on the wire?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, okay, good point. It's not mandatory. You can use unencrypted transports. So if you're doing encryption at the application layer, then you could use an unencrypted transport.
So in which use case would I require or want an encrypted wire in terms of Eth2?
I think this question is out of my expertise, so I don't have a good answer for it. I think maybe we could follow up with Raul next week.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sorry. I'm not. Some of these things are beyond the scope of my knowledge. I don't want to tell you the wrong thing.
No worries. Thank you.
Like one reason that we often want to use it is because some networks, they simply do packet filtering on anything which they don't recognize as, for example, you know, HTTP and HTTPS traffic. So those might be reasons.
Yeah, the RPC protocol that we're using and Gossip Sub don't have their own encryption built in, as far as I know of. So if we have encryption on the transport, it covers both of those.
Right.
But you're just relaying messages through the network, and those messages should be encrypted already at the application layer before they even hit the wire.
So for example, if I'm sending a block to somebody through the RPC, I'm not actually encrypting that block. There's no key to encrypt that.
But why would it need to be encrypted? The payload is Merkle, contains Merkle proofs, and it's cryptographic in nature inherently.
Well, that's cryptographic doesn't mean encrypted, right? So like I can, if I see a Merkle branch, I know I can figure out maybe what that Merkle branch is because it's related to a block. But adding encryption at the network layer prevents people from doing that.
Yeah, just to be clear, we have no encryption at the application layer at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
like
for privacy, right?
Getting past firewalls, getting past anything that inspects packets, whether that's your employer or whoever that might be. I think it's just a normal precaution nowadays. Like you even access Wikipedia through HTTPS, right?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering if that's really within the scope of what we're trying to do to like roll out an MVP, because I feel like those additional primitives kind of bloat the stack we have right now.
Well, I think that's part of the value proposition of libp2p itself. The fact that we can support multiple transport and select a suite of transports that we launch with, but also, you know, have the capability to move on to, or really even support multiple transports at once.
Yeah, why not just use WireGuard?
What do you mean, Zach? What is WireGuard?
VPN tunnel. It's just open source.
Yeah, where?
What's that?
Like VPN to where? Like which?
Well, between point to point, between two separate points. So.
I'm not sure I understand the proposition here. I mean,
look, I think it makes sense to have the capability to support encryption at the wire. We don't encrypt at the application layer, and nor should we necessarily look into encrypting at the application layer. So having this an option is a good thing. Zach, do you want to give us any update on what you've been working on?
We wrapped up the initial, our initial libp2p gossip sub tests. We just had a call with Mike and Raul and Viso. I think it was like a couple days ago. So we're just currently in the process of like designing an actual test phase, like the next test phases with them. I'm drafting something this week, and I'll post it on GitHub. And I would like any feedback from the community in designing these tests and ensuring that the topology is correct based on the consensus of the community. And yeah, that's pretty much where we're at. We're rewriting the client to remove the daemon, our test client, and we started working on a Discovery v5 implementation in C++. So we can perform similar tests and analysis on Discovery v5. We're doing that concurrently.
Cool. Each of you teams seems like you'll have at least like one networking guy. When Zach does post the next plan for tests, I'd love if a few of y'all could take a look before the tests get implemented.
Another thing that we kind of may need to discuss at some point, and this is going to kind of help us move toward multi-client, is like the way that key stores are implemented and like how those key pairs are generated. Like they're using like BLS. Like if we can standardize how the keys are stored, it doesn't really matter like how we do it right now. In my opinion, it just matters for the sake of like interoperability and easy testing that all the clients implement the same kind of function, so we don't have to write individual logic for each specific client. Like in Prism, they use the key store from Geth, but we can really kind of just use like a flat JSON file. We don't really need anything fancy. It's just if we can kind of standardize across clients how that process occurs, then it'll be much easier for like testing and future like interop efforts.
Yeah, I'd throw in there that key storage is very, very platform specific. A lot of platforms offer key stores that are supported by hardware, which typically you want at least, like typically you want to use them. So this might be some kind of standardized import-export view of it, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it doesn't, I don't, in my opinion, I don't think that it's like super important how we do it. It's just what's more important at this stage is just that we can kind of agree and standardize some sort of implementation, however basic. It doesn't need to be necessarily for production purposes, but at least for like these initial R&D and like testing phases, that would be a lot easier. Me and Antoine had a discussion about this, and there's kind of like a lot of it's kind of a pain and like a roadblock for us moving forward and implementing these testing phases.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so we saw that with the Eth2 tester that I did with Moloch, that you can definitely have one client generate all the validator contract and all the accounts and all that stuff into files that could be read again. But it needs to be compliant between the different clients if you want to move a little faster and interrupt. Otherwise, every client is its own snowflakes, and we're gonna have to support all the different implementations of the different ways the key stores could be created. So if we can standardize this, which is probably easier than standardizing most of the networking or interrupt the clients at that level, that would be a good first step.
Yeah, Jacek, I think the import-export would serve that.
Yeah, so whatever that is, we should just define, we should just specify, like write a spec that says, look, this is how we should do it. You know, we can help, and we'll implement that in all the clients. I mean, we just need to agree and specify what it's going to look like, just because it would be much easier.
Cool, agreed. Let's move on from networking to, we have about 10 minutes left, spec discussion. I did want to survey how people are thinking about and searching for attestation slashings. Jim and I were talking about that, and I know that some of you have dug into it, so if someone wants to just kind of give us lay of land as they see it, that might help.
Well, we had a fun discussion about that yesterday. Me and Paul from Sigma Prime, and we came to the conclusion that, like, think about it from a client perspective, that just adds complexity and so on. And there's no real obligation from a protocol point of view to perform slashings or look for them. Could almost outsource that like a third party.
Like a watchtower?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the difficulty lies in the fact that we can't really write conformance tests for it, right? You can't mandate that people find opportunities for slashings, I think, because the problem is difficult. So you can go with heuristics and hope for it, but I don't know.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, we're still keen to do some slashing, even though it's like a bit of a funny thing where you don't necessarily need it in order to work. I know Michael put some effort into it when we were doing our operations pool, so trying to fill up blocks with attestations, and then meeting these edge cases of like, oh, if we find slashing attestations, do we include one of them? Do we include both of them? None of them? I think he found that it was like NP hard in the worst case or something to sort this out.
When you, I think when you were optimizing for profitability, oh no, that was the attestation aggregation. Never mind. Go on.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a little tangential. It's kind of like we discovered that as a result of dealing with the operations pool. We haven't put a whole lot of effort into detecting slashings. I'm not sure we have a full strategy for it. We definitely don't actually. Part of me is thinking about moving it to a separate process, but I'm also not sure whether that really just so that it's not going to chew up capacity that's needed to maintain consensus. But I'm not sure that that's actually just more complexity in the long run. So it's kind of my thoughts at the moment.
Yeah, I definitely view it. I mean, it should definitely be some sort of like at least asynchronous or background job, whether it's its own process or not. Just because you could probably spend all of your time searching for them. So you should probably relegate some portion of time rather than all of it. I'm recently was thinking about how attestations generally our view of the block tree and what we want to even consider narrows every time we have finality, which is a good thing. But in doing so, if we receive an attestation for something that's outside of our block tree, or maybe for something in the past, we may or may not have the requisite data to even calculate, see if the attestation is valid, and see if it, like who is even a part of that attestation. So say it was from 20 epochs ago and we finalized and we've like pruned things. We don't necessarily have the state to go and even verify this attestation. So then, and that under that consideration, even if it was slashable, we might just like discard the attestation. And under that consideration, it's probably fine in general because we finalize things. But it does limit our ability to find these things. So it's not a fully complete thought because I haven't fully thought the thought, but something I'm thinking about a little bit.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a DOS vector for slashes.
In what sense?
I guess if you just pump out all these old things that look like slashings, yeah, then you can.
Or just attestations for things that are like from old portions of the block tree. You know, if we're required to see if they are slashable, or if it's worthwhile to see if they're slashable, then you're right. It like makes you pull up all sorts of like old states and stuff to verify against, which is probably not a good thing.
Yeah, if we wanted to try and incentivize clients to implement slashing, one way to do it might be when we release these test nets is to make a bunch of open source tools that allow people to very easily create malicious blocks. And I'm not sure whether we want to fully open source or give them to specific people, but like add the ability for people to cause chaos, and then once basically if your client doesn't support it, then you fall offline. Maybe that's the way we incentivize people. It's not really protocol level, but something.
And something we do want to have test nets in which like 50% of the validators go offline, and we go through an inactivity leak. And during those times, when I guess your block tree becomes relatively large with respect to your latest finalize, and those are the times that you'd be most concerned about people, going back 2 epochs and signing something new, and attempting to mess with things. So like we should definitely create these scenarios.
I'd also be interested a little bit in thinking about or really hearing thoughts on slashing protection. And there's been talk of clients stashing away, data in order to ensure that they don't accidentally cause a slashable condition for their validator. And what would be, how much extra data do we have to store because of that? Say that we voted for a branch that later became unviable, so that clients don't create a slashable condition by accident because they've forgotten about it, stuff like this. So
the requisite data held is actually can be very narrow. Pretty much if you remember your latest attestation, this is not optimal in terms of the optionality given, but if you remember your latest attestation, you can pretty much always just not vote on something that is from the past at all. I need to consider whether that covers all the scenarios requisite. I'll add. I can add a little bit more to the validator guide and like what's the minimal that you can keep.
Yeah, that was my understanding too. That if you, as long as you never vote in the future, there's always this case where you can choose to just skip a couple of duties and then you're safe again. But if your clock screws up and you vote in the future, you got to wait until you're safe.
Yeah, the only case in which that's not true is if say your node for, so you generally are going to follow the latest justified, but if your node somehow forgets the latest justified and points to a previous justified and points to a new fork, then you could end up doing a surround.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's that particular case, and how to prevent that is probably the most interesting problem. The corner case that I'd be concerned about. So I'll think about it a little bit more after this call. Cool, yeah. Slashing is hard, but something that we literally cannot launch without. So whether it is baked into clients or whether we have some sort of other processes running, we as a group need to solve this problem. Cool. Open spec discussion. Anything people want to have questions about or want to discuss before we close? We have a couple minutes left. Great. Open discussion, closing remarks, anything not related to the spec, but that you want to say. Joseph, do you want to give us an update on what you've been working on?
The interop or the depository?
Interop.
Yeah, so we got a place, and we got the contract signed. It's a place in, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's in north of Toronto called Muskoka. It'll fit like probably 25 people comfortably and like 35 people like really uncomfortably. And yeah, so September 6th through 13th. Yeah, that's.
Are you maintaining any sort of like RSVP so we can get a handle on?
Yeah, that's forthcoming. I'm sorry.
Right, cool.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that we had the place kind of nailed down before I did that sort of stuff, and kind of we iterated through a few different locations because some of them weren't. I didn't think that they were ideal. And so yeah, we settled on this one. And so as soon as we have kind of like the check cut to that place, I'll definitely send out RSVPs. It is difficult to send because it's kind of like we want like typically like in the terms of like when we did the workshop before, you just kind of advertise it. This is going to have to be different. You know, we have to kind of like restrict it to basically implementers and researchers only. So if somebody has a good email list of kind of like the Eth2 implementation teams, that would be awesome because then we can send it out that way.
Yeah, cool. I probably have something.
Okay, cool. I'll get with you about that. Thanks, Jenny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for organizing things. Okay, we are at an hour and a half. Any final remarks before we close?
Just a reminder that the DevCon application is open, the call for presentation, and everyone, if you are interested in speaking at DevCon, and please submit your application. That's it.
Yep, thank you. Okay, cool. We're closing. Thank you, everyone. Very productive meeting. We'll keep things going on the spec towards the spec freeze and keep up the great work. Talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
See you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.